this decline of the G7 countries, especially the U.S. and its Western allies, and everyone that they're taking with them. Ukraine is a big part of this. And I'm wondering what your take on where this conflict is at this point, because in recent days you had Antonio Guterres, a UN chief, say there's no chance of a peace agreement anytime soon. You had Henry Kissinger, of all people, with a much more rosy prediction saying that this year is a turning point, and there's very well a possibility that China can be a big part of a peace process. Sometimes it feels like the world is upside down when you see things like that going on. But what is your take on where this conflict is at this point, and any remarks you have on its significance at this moment in history?
Well, I wish it were otherwise, of course, but I don't see any early end to the war. I don't see what the basis for it would be. In Shakespeare's Scottish play, Macbeth, the question is asked, am I steeped in blood so far that it is bloodier to go on or to go o'er? And I think that that's the position that Russia finds itself in now. And it would be inexplicable were Russia to cease its special military operations, leaving 60% of Ukraine in the hands of the Nazified Ukrainian nationalist administration, with Ukraine perhaps not a member of NATO, but NATO very definitely being heavily present in Ukraine. That would be a recipe for future conflict and terror in decades to come. So I cannot believe that Vladimir Putin will cease the operation until the goals are achieved, and they have not yet nearly been achieved. I take the view that without a regime change in Kiev, there can be no peace negotiations, because if the Russians are steeped in blood so far, so are the current coup regime in Kiev. So I don't think there's any possibility, even if he was allowed to. And it's a moot point because I don't think Zelensky wants to anyway. I don't think the people around him want to in any case. But if he did, the US and Poland and the United Kingdom and the other most warlike parts of NATO would not permit it. So it seems to me that this war, I'm sorry to say this genuinely, will continue until a military victory followed by political change in Kiev is achieved.
Well, you had Mr. Joseph Borrell, all the Europe's wonder boy of the so-called foreign ministry, whatever they call themselves in the EU. They say that they're diplomats, but Joseph Borrell, this top diplomat, foreign policy chief, he said quite plainly that this is not the time for peace. This is the time to give Ukraine what it wants to win the war. And of course, we know back in April of 2022, it was the West that stepped in and nixed a possible peace agreement that would have shortened this war by many, many months. It would have concluded in April of 2022. It's only a couple months. But I wanted to actually transition. I know that we have limited time here with you. So given that there isn't this really any impetus for peace, especially on the side of the West, what do you have to say about this Victory Day debacle? May 9th, of course, is every year is kind of this very special day around the world. Some celebrate May 8th, I believe, in certain parts of the world, especially the former Soviet republics. But it's the Victory Day against fascism, against Nazism during World War II. And you had something very interesting happen where you had Russia thank China, thank the United States. You had Putin thank China, the United States, and every ally that fought on the side against Nazism. And then you had Ursula von der Leyen and Volodymyr Zelensky celebrate Victory Day by declaring a Europe Day and not mentioning the Soviet Union, not mentioning Russia, right? They used it as a chip against Russia. What do you have to make of this, given what you said earlier about your connection to those who fought in the war, and this all important question of how do we celebrate Victory Day and how it's been politicized?
Well, von der Leyen's father and grandfather were fighting on the other side, of course. So you can imagine a little bit of humility from her might have been in order, but she doesn't do humility. Many German people marched on Victory Day. One even managed to get the banner of victory back up on top of the Reichstag, now known as the Bundestag. If I knew who that was, I couldn't tell you, or I'd have to kill you. But it was an act of great daring and significance. And the people who know what happened best, there are outside the German parliament, there are Soviet tanks, not 500 meters from the Bundestag. They are there as a reminder of what happened the last time that revanchist Germany sought to use its military power in pursuit of its fascistic, racist delirium of seeking to literally, physically annihilate, extirpate from this earth whole sections of the world's population, to massacre every last Jew, to massacre every last Slav, every homosexual, every Jehovah's Witness, every communist, every leftist, and so on. This was industrialized genocide. You'd think everyone would be together in celebrating the defeat of such a thing. But as you rightly say, they were not. As General Zhukov, the victor at Berlin, pointed out at the time, we have liberated Europe from fascism. Europe will never forgive us. And indeed, they never did forgive the Soviet Union, the Russian people now. They never did forgive them, because this was a major and eternal feather in the cap of the Russian people, of the Soviet peoples, that can never be taken away from them. They can set up new days, call them Europe Day. I don't know. Maybe Europe Day is going to commemorate all the countries that Europeans colonized and slaughtered and enslaved. That might be a decent Europe Day, but you can avoid it if you like, but you can never change it. You can never change the fact that it was the Red Army that inflicted 8 out of 10 of every casualty suffered by Nazi Germany in the Second World War. It was the Soviet Union that lost 26 million people in that epic struggle in 4 years. It was the Soviet victory at Stalingrad that turned the tide of the war. G.I. Joe and Tommy Atkins were nowhere, man, in the defeat of fascism. I will say, for Tommy Atkins and the British, if they had not refused to surrender in 1940, history would have been very different. So Britain will always have that credit in the bank, that when all around us had collapsed and run away and surrendered and collaborated, the British people under Churchill refused to do that. But other than that, in 1940-41, the Battle of Britain in 1941, our contribution to the final victory was minuscule, as was the American contribution. Of course, the bravery in 1944 on the beaches at Normandy and D-Day will never be forgotten, and neither should it be. But it's minuscule compared to the contribution made by the Russians. So if you hate Russia, You're going to hate May the 9th. Every year you're going to hate it because it reminds everyone all over again of who was who and what was what.
Yeah, and there's a lot of hatred of Russia going around across the West, and especially in Ukraine, where that government has been de-Russifying Ukraine through its brutal, war campaign over the last 8+ years. But that extends all the way into government policy, education, etc. How language, right? The spelling of Kiev versus Kyiv. All of this is to de-Russify Ukraine. But what's I guess maybe your final thoughts on this. A lot of people have been sending me this kind of metaphor where they would say, well, if today were World War II, the United States would be railing against the Soviet Union for supposedly invading Germany unprovoked. Your thoughts?
Well, it'll always be chicken Kiev to me, just like Paris will always be Paris, whatever the French people call it. So I don't go for this linguistic nonsense. The Poles have just given a new name, to Kaliningrad, which is part of Russia. The Poles have given it a name which I apologize, I'm unable to pronounce. And I'm not sure anyone outside of Poland will ever call it that. This kind of nonsense rewriting, geography rewriting, history rewriting, the politics of conflicts now long gone is fatuous, foolish, and says more about the people doing it than it does about the people to whom they're doing it. So I don't myself think that these barking dogs on the Baltic fringe will succeed in changing the significant Everestian significant facts, which are this: that Russia and China are now essentially one country, with one economy, with co-dependencies. So Russian oil and gas goes one way, Chinese manufacturing goods come the other way. The depth, I mean, you made the point earlier about Russia not being counted in Europe Day. Russia is the biggest country in Europe. Moscow is the biggest city in Europe. These are facts that can't be changed just by pretending that things are otherwise. So the significant facts of which I speak are that Russia and China are now effectively one country, one military, one set of economic relationships. India and Iran, Brazil and South Africa, almost all of Latin America, all but one country in Latin America, and all but, I think, one country in Africa, are all rapidly coming together as a cohesive political and economic and, if necessary, military reality. Sorry, I'm fancy me forgetting the Middle East. If you now look almost from Marrakesh to Bahrain, from the Atlantic to the Gulf, all the Arab countries are now looking to China and to Russia. None of them are looking to the United States, still fewer to Britain or France. So these giant tectonic shifts that I have just quickly adumbrated cannot be reversed. So what does that leave? It leaves the French trying to encourage visitors to the Tour d'Eiffel, the English to the Trafalgar Square, the Germans to the Bavarian Woods, and so on. It means our future is a lesser future. And there will be many, many people around the world who suffered under the hegemony of the European empires. They will be very glad about that.
Yeah, and if I have you for one or two more minutes, what you said about the Middle East is so important because we've been talking a lot about Ukraine and China, Asia and Europe, but maybe your thoughts just on even the last several days. Syria's back in the Arab League. That war is over in the official sense. And you had Yemen, peace talks happening between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and that war, and of course the Iran-Saudi Arabia deal brokered in Beijing. I mean, you spoke out heavily against the West's invasion of Iraq, the U.S. and the West's invasion of Iraq during that period. I guess your final reflections and thoughts on that seismic change.
Well, it could scarcely be more seismic, and I'd be lying if I said to you that I had predicted it, because I certainly didn't. Having spent the best part of my life in the Arab world, deeply immersed in the Arab world, I never expected this pace of change and this 180-degree turn. 1 minute, Saudi Arabia was, and its Gulf allies, pardon me, was an American satrapy until abruptly it wasn't, until it decided to sell petrol to the Chinese in RMB, until it decided to apply to join the BRICS and to get alongside the SCO. And of course, where Saudi Arabia went, its Gulf allies went with it. That meant automatically an end to the murderous conflict in Yemen that has cost the lives of so many people, both directly as a result of the war, but also from famine and disease, cholera, and all the four horsemen of the apocalypse were riding across Yemen. Suddenly that's over. I spent 10 years of my life trying to get people to pay attention to the conflict in Yemen, and now it's over, just like that. The Americans are furious that it's over. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the Americans denouncing the Arab League's readmission of Syria to its ranks. The idea that the Americans can decide who's in the Arab League, the clue being in the name, is laughable, really, but they did it with a straight face. Your Foreign Affairs Committee in Congress issued a very grave pronunciamento about how awful this was. They didn't seem to see the irony in a country thousands of miles away, whose influence on the region is now practically nil. I mean, you know what I think would be an interesting exercise? Because if I tell you the biggest television station in the Arab world right now is RT Arabic, Russian, in Arabic. That's the biggest station, bigger than Al Jazeera, bigger than any of the others. RT Arabic is the biggest TV station. I think if you put up Voice of America in the Arab world now against Russian Arabic media services, nobody would listen to the American one except to laugh at it. Nobody would watch the American except to laugh at it. That's how comprehensive the change has been. And that will have its impact. You mentioned some of them: the Saudi-Iran deal, the re-establishment of diplomatic relations, reopening of embassies, and the proxy conflicts between these two powers, like the one in Lebanon, like the one in Syria, like the one that we've just discussed in Yemen, but also elsewhere in the Arab world. These conflicts will now come to an end. Ineluctably, they must come to an end. And that is pregnant with enormous potential consequences for the Americans, but perhaps most immediately for the American outpost called Israel. Israel is now surrounded by countries that are technologically capable of dealing with it militarily, increasingly united, and with, if you like, a center of gravity in Eurasia that they did not have before. Israel only has an America that is overstretched, overreaching. Its armor is empty, its currency debased. You know, if we had time, I'd give you the benefit of my reading on the collapse of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire collapsed because it overstretched, it overreached, it debased its currency. It could no longer butter the parsnips of the ruling elites in the satrapies that Rome controlled. It could not keep them happy on the periphery. And simultaneously, Rome fell within, imploded in increasing debauchery, degeneracy of all kinds. If that doesn't sound familiar to your American viewers, I don't know what else I could say. Thanks, Danny, very much for the interview.
No. Thank you for taking the time out. Indeed, a better world is in birth. And of course, Rome is burning 2.0. So it's really good to be with you today, Mr. Galloway. And please come on again at any time. And I'll be sure to be in touch with you